I always thought the night shift at the gas station would be easy. Long hours, yes, but quiet, almost monotonous. There was a strange comfort in the hum of the overhead lights, the low buzz of the cooler in the back, and the way the clock seemed to drag its hands across the face with painful slowness. It was just me, a few aisles of snacks, the faint smell of burnt coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer, and the occasional traveler who stumbled in for cigarettes or a drink before heading back onto the endless highway. That's how I thought it would always be. Simple, predictable, until the night the customer came in. It was a little past 3 in the morning when the bell above the door jingled. That sound had become so routine that I hardly even looked up anymore, but something about it that night felt heavier, like the chime had dragged a cold weight inside with it. The air seemed to shift, thicker somehow, as though the walls of the store had pulled closer. He walked in without hurry, his footsteps almost too quiet for how heavy his boots looked. A man tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a long coat that trailed just above his ankles. His face was pale, sallow under the harsh fluorescent light, but his eyes, there was nothing remarkable about them at first glance. Ordinary. Yet the longer I looked, the more I realized there was no real focus in them. They weren't blank, not exactly, but unfixed, like someone looking past you, past everything, into a space you couldn't see. He didn't say anything. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of late-night customers came in without wanting small talk, but the silence stretched, thick and strange. He wandered slowly through the aisles, brushing his fingertips along the bags of chips as though testing their texture, pausing at random, then moving on. Something about his pacing unsettled me. Most people came in knowing what they wanted, grabbed it, and left. But he lingered. He wasn't browsing either. There was no searching in his movements, no decision-making. It was as if he already knew everything on the shelves, yet needed to touch each item anyway, as though reacquainting himself with an old memory. After what felt like an eternity, he came to the counter. He placed a single item down, a bottle of water. The label was faded, dust clinging to the cap, like it had been sitting on the shelf for months untouched. I scanned it, slid it back toward him, and waited. He didn't move, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't pat down his coat, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just stood there, staring at me with those unfocused eyes. The hum of the cooler behind me grew louder, almost like a growl. I cleared my throat, shifting my weight. My skin prickled under his gaze. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, too slowly. He pulled out exact change, set the coins down on the counter with deliberate precision, and took the water. Then he turned, walked back toward the door, and stepped outside. The bell jingled again, lighter this time, but the weight in the air didn't leave with him. I thought that was the end of it, just a strange man in the middle of the night. But when I glanced up from the register 10 minutes later, I saw him again, standing in aisle 3. I froze. I hadn't heard the door. The bell never rang. He was just there, in the same long coat, his back to me as he touched the rows of cereal boxes. The bottle of water sat forgotten in his hand, unopened. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to convince myself maybe he had never left, that maybe I had looked away, and he had wandered back inside. But no, there had been no sound. No door, no chime, nothing. It was as though he had seeped back into the store through the walls. The minutes dragged by. I busied myself with wiping the counter, with pretending to check stock on the shelves behind me. But every time I glanced toward aisle 3, he was still there, moving slowly, touching each box like it mattered. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Just once. Quick enough to dismiss as faulty wiring, but long enough that for a split second, the store was plunged into absolute black. When the light steadied again, he was gone. The aisle stood empty. My heart thudded against my ribs. The hum of the cooler seemed louder than ever, the smell of burnt coffee stronger, almost rancid. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was tired, that night shifts played tricks on the mind. But the unease clung to me like static. Hours passed. Near dawn, when the sky began to pale outside the windows, I allowed myself to relax. The night was over, and soon the day clerk would come in, and I could go home. I poured the last of the bitter coffee into a styrofoam cup, grimacing at the acrid taste. And then the bell jingled again. I looked up, and there he was. The same man, the same coat, the same water bottle in his hand, still unopened, condensation forming on the outside as though it had been sitting there for hours. He stepped inside like he had never been gone. This time, he didn't go to the aisles. He didn't wander. He walked straight to the counter, placed the water bottle down, and stared at me. His eyes still weren't focused, but now I realized they weren't empty either. They were too full, too heavy with something I couldn't name. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The store felt suffocating, the air thick with something sour and metallic, like rust or blood. The lights above buzzed louder, the cooler rattled as though straining against some unseen weight. He leaned closer, though I never saw his feet move. 1 second he was standing across the counter. The next his face was inches from mine, pale and waxy under the buzzing light. His breath smelled of damp earth, like soil freshly turned after rain. And then, he was gone. The bottle remained on the counter, droplets of water running down its sides. But the man was nowhere. No door chime, no sound, nothing. Just the empty store and the echo of my racing heartbeat. When the day clerk finally arrived, I left without a word. I didn't even clock out. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I never went back to that job. Not once. They called me, left messages, even mailed me my last check. But I didn't step foot inside that station again. Because I know the truth. That customer never left. Not really. And some nights, when the house is quiet, when I get up at 3 in the morning and walk into the kitchen for a glass of water, I swear I can still hear the faint jingle of a door chime that isn't there. Footsteps in the Ward. Narrated by Melissa, 36, night nurse in Bangor, Maine. Hospitals at night feel nothing like they do during the day. During the day, the wards are full of motion, voices, footsteps, rolling carts, the endless churn of machines and conversation. There's a rhythm, almost comforting in its chaos. But at night, that rhythm dies. The halls grow long and silent, and the fluorescent lights overhead feel colder, sharper. They don't illuminate so much as they bleach, turning skin pale and shadows darker. I learned quickly during my years on the night shift that the silence was never truly silent. Hospitals breathe. They hum. The vents sigh. Old pipes knock and shudder deep in the walls. Monitors chirp softly from rooms where patients sleep under heavy sedation. You hear all of it, every subtle sound, because there's nothing else to fill the void. But that night, the sound I heard didn't belong to the usual chorus. It was past 2 in the morning, the hour when exhaustion dulls the mind and everything seems to stretch. I was stationed in one of the older wings of the hospital, the kind that still carried the scent of decades-old disinfectant buried deep into the tile and grout. The walls were pale green, their paint bubbled in places from years of moisture. The floor had been polished earlier that evening, but the waxy sheen only highlighted the hairline cracks in the linoleum. The air smelled faintly metallic, like the residue of surgical instruments, mixed with the stale tang of antiseptic. Somewhere down the hall, a television muttered faint static, its signal not quite strong enough to hold an image. Most of my patients were asleep. A few stirred restlessly, their machines monitoring the fragile rhythm of their bodies. I had been charting quietly at the nurse's station, my pen scratching softly against the paper when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The steady thud of shoes against the polished linoleum. At first, I thought nothing of it. Other nurses moved through the ward at odd hours, and doctors sometimes came to check on a patient during the night. But as I paused, listening, I realized the sound wasn't moving toward me. It wasn't moving away either. It was pacing, back and forth. A measured rhythm, too even, too deliberate. Heel toe, heel toe. The sound carried faintly down the corridor, echoing just enough to blur its source. I leaned slightly, peering down the hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale rectangles across the floor, but the hallway looked empty. Every door was closed, every shadow undisturbed. I waited, holding my breath. The footsteps continued. Thud, thud, thud. Measured, unhurried, almost rehearsed. I rose slowly from the station, the chair squeaking softly against the floor. My heart had begun to beat a little faster, though I told myself it was just a colleague, maybe making rounds, maybe checking something quietly. I stepped into the corridor, the air noticeably cooler beyond the small pool of warmth cast by the desk lamp. The chill wrapped around me like damp fabric, clinging as I walked toward the sound. Each step I took, the footsteps grew clearer, but the source remained hidden. I passed room after room, glancing briefly through their narrow windows. Patients lay still, machines humming softly beside them. Nothing out of place. Yet the footsteps persisted. The corridor seemed longer than usual, stretched thin under the fluorescent glow. The lights above flickered faintly just once, but enough to throw shadows across the floor that didn't quite match my movements. The air smelled heavier here, damp, carrying a faint odor of mildew seeping from the old walls. I stopped midway down the hall. The footsteps stopped too. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned slowly, scanning the corridor. Empty. I could hear the faint hiss of the ventilation system, the low beep of a heart monitor from behind a closed door, but nothing else. Then, directly behind me, footsteps. Just two. Sharp, deliberate, right against the floor. I spun, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway stretched out, pale and empty, every shadow undisturbed. The air felt wrong, heavy against my chest, pressing inward. My skin prickled, and for a moment, I thought I caught the faint scent of something else beneath the antiseptic, something sour, earthy, like soil turned over after rain. I backed slowly toward the nurse's station, each step echoing too loudly in the corridor. When I reached the small pool of light, I gripped the edge of the desk tightly, my knuckles whitening. I waited. The footsteps resumed. Not behind me now, but further down the hall, pacing again. Back and forth. Heel toe. Heel toe. I refused to leave the station again. Instead, I sat rigid in the chair, every muscle tense, listening. The pacing went on for minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. Time stretched thin, the second hand on the clock dragging with unbearable slowness. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the ward again. I almost convinced myself it had been nothing but exhaustion, my mind filling the quiet with imagined sound. I bent my head to the chart, forcing myself to write, to anchor my thoughts in something ordinary. That was when I heard the door. Room 214. The handle clicked. The door creaked open slowly. I froze. I knew that room. The patient inside had passed earlier that evening. I had been the one to cover the body with a sheet, to dim the lights, to close the door quietly behind me until transport could take them away in the morning. But now the door was opening. I stared across the hall, my pen slipping from my fingers. The door moved inch by inch, revealing only darkness inside. No light spilled from the room. No shadow crossed the threshold. Yet the faint, unmistakable sound of footsteps drifted out. One step. Another. Slow, deliberate. They moved into the hall, though nothing visible accompanied them. The air thickened, colder, sharper, like a knife pressed lightly against skin. My pulse hammered in my ears. The footsteps grew closer, unhurried. They reached the center of the corridor, paused, then turned, directly toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The smell of damp earth filled my nose, overwhelming, as though the grave itself had opened somewhere nearby. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, then flickered, plunging the corridor into momentary darkness. In that instant, I felt it. Not a touch, but a presence, something brushing close, passing just inches from me, heavy and cold, thick enough that my chest constricted. My eyes watered, my body trembling against the chair, as though the very air had hands that pressed into me. When the light steadied again, the corridor was empty. The door to 214 was closed once more, the handle unmoved. The footsteps were gone. The silence returned, heavier now, as though holding its breath. I didn't chart another word that night. I sat frozen, waiting for dawn, for the relief shift to arrive, for the sun to push back the shadows that clung too tightly to that ward. When morning came, the body in 214 was taken away. No one spoke of it. No one mentioned the sound of footsteps in the night. But I know what I heard. And some nights, when I work late, when the hall stretches long and empty, I still catch the faintest echo. Heel, toe, heel, toe. The sound of someone walking the ward who should not be there. The empty warehouse. Narrated by Jared, 40, night security guard in Spokane, Washington. People don't realize how unsettling warehouses are when the world goes quiet. By day they're nothing but noise, forklifts whining, pallets slamming, the chatter of workers, and the constant rattle of metal doors. But at night, when the last truck pulls away and the locks click into place, those cavernous spaces don't feel empty. They feel like they're waiting. The warehouse where I worked security was massive, 3 football fields long, with ceilings so high the rafters disappeared into shadow. The smell of old wood and cold steel clung to everything, mixed with the faint chemical tang of cleaning solvents that seeped into the concrete floor over the years. Even after everyone left, that smell lingered, sharp and artificial, as though the building itself was trying to cover something older. My job was simple enough. Walk the perimeter every hour, check the doors, monitor the cameras, and sit at the desk until sunrise. Boring work, mostly. The kind of job you take when you need quiet and don't mind solitude. And I didn't mind it at first. But there's a different quality to silence in a place that large. You notice how it doesn't sit evenly. It gathers in corners, behind rows of crates, beneath the steel catwalks that line the walls. The air doesn't feel still. It feels heavy, full of something you can't see, but are certain is there. That night started like all the others. Midnight rounds, every door secure, every light buzzing dully overhead. I sat in the control booth, sipping coffee gone cold, watching the bank of monitors flick between empty aisles. The cameras were old, grainy, black and white. They distorted the light, made shadows bloom where they shouldn't, stretched edges until the frames looked wrong. I had learned not to stare too long at them. Staring too long made you imagine things. Still, it was nearly 2 in the morning when something caught my eye. Camera 6. A figure. It was faint, the outline broken by static, but unmistakably a person walking slowly down one of the central aisles. Tall, moving steady, almost deliberate. At first, I thought maybe someone had stayed behind, a worker asleep in a corner who had woken late. But the place was supposed to be cleared and checked before I ever clocked in. And besides, the way the figure moved was wrong. Too smooth. Too quiet. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The figure passed directly beneath a flickering light. For just a second, the grain of the camera cleared enough to show detail. There was no face. Just pale, blank skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. I jerked back from the monitor, my pulse spiking in my throat. I blinked, looked again, nothing. The aisle was empty. Just crates stacked 10 feet high, their labels peeling, their edges casting long shadows against the concrete floor. I told myself it had been a glitch. The cameras were old, prone to freezing, warping, dragging one frame across another. I forced myself to sit back, to breathe. But the air felt heavier now, the booth smaller, as if the walls leaned in closer. The sound reached me a few minutes later. Footsteps. Not loud, barely more than a scuff. But in a warehouse that size, footsteps carry. They echoed faintly, distant but steady, a hollow rhythm that bounced off the steel and concrete. I froze, listening. The sound didn't match the hum of machinery or the groan of cooling pipes. This was sharper, more precise. Heel. Toe. Heel. Toe. Someone was walking the aisles. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk, its beam sharp and too white against the gloom, and stepped out of the booth. The air outside felt colder, stiller, as though the warehouse had been holding its breath. The vastness pressed down immediately, the ceiling too high, the walls too far, the aisles stretching into endless darkness. I followed the sound, my boots clicking against the concrete, the flashlight slicing through stacks of pallets and crates. Dust floated in the beam, glittering faintly before vanishing into the black. The footsteps stopped when I did. I stood still, heart hammering, the silence swelling in around me like a tide. Then, off to my left, the sound resumed. Slow, steady, as though whoever, or whatever, it was knew I was listening. I swung the light toward the noise. The beam illuminated nothing but rows of boxes and the faint gleam of steel beams. Shadows leapt and shrank with every shift of my hand. I forced myself to walk down the aisle. Each step echoed too loudly, bouncing back at me from the high walls. The smell of dust grew thicker, dry and sharp, coating my throat. Halfway down, the light flickered. Just once. The beam dimmed, then flared back, but in that instant I saw it. A shape at the end of the aisle. Tall, unmoving. Watching. My chest tightened, a cold weight pressing down. I blinked, wiped my eyes, aimed the flashlight again. Nothing. Empty space. But I knew what I had seen. The air grew colder as I turned back toward the booth, each step quicker than the last. My ears strained against the silence, desperate for sound, yet dreading it. When I reached the booth, I locked the door behind me, though I knew it wouldn't matter. I sat back in the chair, trying to steady my breathing. That was when I noticed camera 6 again. The aisle was empty, but in the far corner, where the shadows gathered thickest, something shifted. A ripple, like fabric moving against itself. Then two shapes, round, dark, like sockets staring directly at the lens. I turned off the monitor. I couldn't look anymore. The rest of the night crawled by. Every sound seemed sharper, the creak of the metal roof cooling, the whine of wind seeping through cracks, the faint drip of condensation hitting the floor. I didn't dare leave the booth again. The flashlight lay useless on the desk, its battery drained to nothing, though I had only used it for minutes. When the first sliver of dawn leaked through the high windows, I felt some of the weight lift. By the time the day crew arrived, the warehouse sounded alive again, voices, machines, clattering metal. The night retreated, leaving only the lingering stench of dust and the bitter taste of fear in my mouth. I never told anyone. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. Just another night guard, alone too long in a big, empty space. That's all it would have been to them. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. The warehouse isn't empty. It never is. Because when the lights go out and the cameras flicker and the footsteps echo across the concrete, something walks those aisles. Something that doesn't want to be seen, but always makes sure it's heard. Voices on the radio. Narrated by Claudia, 31, night operator, Duluth, Minnesota. The world feels different when you're the only person awake in a place built for hundreds. I worked the overnight shift at a small freight station on the edge of Duluth, not far from the lake. The building was old, a block of brick and steel that had once thrummed with the noise of passing trains. By my time there, it had quieted down, Most freight moved during the day, and the night belonged to silence. My job was to sit in the operator's office, monitor the radio lines, and respond to any traffic that came through. Simple, repetitive, uneventful. Or at least, that's what I thought when I started. The office itself was a narrow room with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew seeping through the walls. A single strip of fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering just often enough to set my teeth on edge. The desk was scarred with years of coffee cups and cigarette burns, and the radio console in front of me hummed constantly, its static a thin thread that filled the silence like an artificial heartbeat. I used to tell myself that static was comforting, but on nights like that one, it felt more like breathing. It was just after 1 in the morning. The trains had stopped hours ago, the tracks outside slick with frost that glimmered faintly beneath the weak yard lights. The office was warm enough, but the air still carried the metallic bite of old rails, sharp in my nose, heavy in my lungs. I sat back in the chair, nursing a cup of bitter coffee, letting the hum of the radio wash over me. That was when the first voice came through. At first, it was faint, so faint I thought it was nothing but interference. A crackle, a hiss, then a sound beneath it. A man's voice, low and distorted, muffled by static. I leaned forward, twisting the dial slightly, trying to clear the line. The words sharpened, though not enough to be clear. Just fragments. Pleading, almost desperate. My skin prickled as though the air itself had tightened around me. The voice cut out suddenly, replaced once more by steady static. I stared at the console, waiting, my pulse loud in my ears. No one should have been transmitting at that hour. No trains were scheduled. No workers remained in the yard. The lines were dead unless activated. Yet I had heard it, clear enough that I knew it hadn't been my imagination. I told myself it was bleed over, a stray signal picked up from another frequency. It happened sometimes in older systems. But something about the tone of that voice lingered in my head, sharp and urgent, like the echo of someone calling from a long distance. Half an hour later, it happened again. This time, the voice was clearer, still broken by static, but distinct enough to carry weight. A name slipped through, though I almost wished it hadn't. Peterson. I froze. The name echoed in my mind like a cold bell. I knew that name. Everyone who had worked the station for long enough knew it. Peterson had been a line worker, years before I arrived. He'd been killed in the yard, caught between 2 cars during a late-night coupling operation. A freak accident, they'd called it. Tragic, unavoidable. His death had been quick, they said. I had never known him, but the older men told stories sometimes, in hushed voices, always late at night when the coffee had gone stale and the silence grew too thick. They said his voice had been heard before. On the radios, in the static, always after midnight, always calling out. I had never believed them, until that night. The voice came again, louder, fractured by the hiss but carrying words now. Not many, just enough to hollow me out. It was asking for help. Not in a frantic way, but in a steady, resigned tone, as though repeating something that had already been said countless times before. Pleading into the void, never answered, never resolved. My throat tightened. The radio hissed, crackled, then fell silent once more. The steady hum returned, filling the room with its mechanical breath. The office felt colder. My skin prickled as though a draft had slipped through, though every window was shut, every door locked. I sipped the coffee, but it tasted sour, metallic, like rust. The fluorescent light flickered, buzzing louder, then steadied. The clock ticked on. At 2:15, the voice returned. But this time, it wasn't faint. It cut through the static with startling clarity, the sound filling the room as if the man stood just beside me. His voice was low, pained, dragging each word like a weight. The tone was unmistakably human, too human. I could hear his breath, ragged, strained, caught between words. The radio wasn't just carrying a signal. It was carrying presence. The air in the office thickened, heavy with the scent of oil and earth, like damp soil pressed beneath steel. My ears rang faintly, though the sound came only from the radio. Again, the name. Peterson. Drawn out, stretched across the static like a thread pulled too thin. I sat frozen, unable to move, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk, so tightly my nails dug into the wood. My chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow bursts, my body reacting to something my mind couldn't yet accept. Then came something worse. The sound of metal. Not through the room, but through the radio. A screeching clang, the unmistakable groan of steel grinding against steel. It was so real that I felt the vibration in my teeth, the echo in my bones. A sound no signal should have carried. And beneath it, his voice again, louder now. Not words, not language, just raw, human agony, pressed into a shape too large for the small speaker in front of me. I reached for the dial with a shaking hand, desperate to turn it off, but the knob refused to budge. The static grew louder, swallowing the cry, layering it with new sounds. Footsteps, slow, dragging, as though heavy boots scraped across gravel. And then silence. Not static. Not the hum. Nothing. The absence of sound filled the room like a weight, pressing against my ears until I thought they'd burst. The fluorescent light buzzed, the clock ticked, but none of it felt real. When the radio came alive again, I flinched so hard the chair scraped back across the floor. A whisper, right against the speaker, so close I could hear the wet catch of breath, the faint rattle in the throat. Not Peterson. My name, spoken in a voice I didn't know. The sound crawled through me like ice water, every hair on my body standing on end. The whisper lingered, repeating, the syllables slurred as though dragged from beneath heavy earth. I shut the console down completely, yanking the switch so hard I nearly broke it. The hum died. The static faded. The room plunged into a silence that was almost worse. But I couldn't listen anymore. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, my body rigid in the chair, every muscle tense. I watched the door, the window, the blank face of the dead radio. Waiting, listening. When dawn finally came, I left without waiting for relief. I walked out into the cold morning air, the tracks silvered with frost, the world blessedly alive with the sound of distant traffic. I never worked another night at that station. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, when the hour stretches thin and sleep won't come, I still hear it. A faint crackle, a hiss, a voice just beneath the static. And in the spaces between words, a whisper I can never mistake. Calling my name.